The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone plaza in front of Buckingham Palace. As tourists gathered with their cameras ready, among the crowd stood a woman in her mid-50s named Margaret Whitmore. Though she preferred to be called by her maiden name, which she'd legally changed back to after her third divorce, she wore designer sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent and carried a purse that jangled with unnecessary keychains and decorative charms. Margaret had flown all the way from Connecticut specifically for this European vacation, though she'd spent most of the trip complaining about the tea being too weak, the hotel beds being too firm, and the steering wheels being on the wrong side of the car. Her daughter Emma, a 28-year-old graphic designer, walked beside her with shoulders slightly hunched. Already exhausted, despite it being only 10 in the morning, the royal guards stood at their posts like living statues, their red uniforms crisp and their bearskin hats towering above their heads. Their faces remained completely neutral, eyes fixed straight ahead as hundreds of tourists snapped photos and children waved at them hoping for a reaction. These guards were members of the Household Division, soldiers who had served in combat zones and earned the honor of protecting the royal residence. They took their duty seriously, maintaining perfect discipline no matter what distractions occurred around them. Margaret pushed through the crowd. With her usual lack of awareness for personal space, she'd already irritated several tourists that morning by blocking their photos and speaking loudly on her phone about how unimpressed she was with everything she'd seen. Emma apologized quietly to the people her mother bumped into, offering weak smiles that said she was used to this behavior. When Margaret reached the front of the crowd near one of the guards, she pulled out her phone and stepped directly in front of him. The guard's name was James Thornberry, 32-year-old veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning his position in the Queen's Guard. He stood exactly 6 feet tall, though his bearskin hat added another 18 inches. His blue eyes remained focused on the middle distance, his expression as unchangeable as the stone walls behind him. Margaret held up her phone and leaned in close to James, angling for a selfie. She pressed herself against the rope barrier, extending her arm with the phone, trying to get both herself and the guard in frame. When the first photo didn't satisfy her, she moved even closer, her shoulder now touching the rope. "Emma, come take a better picture of me," Margaret called out without looking back. "This angle makes my chin look weird." Emma reluctantly stepped forward, taking her mother's phone. She'd been through this routine at every landmark they'd visited. Margaret never thought the first 20 photos were good enough. "Can you smile or something?" Margaret said loudly to James, as if he were a theme park employee. "What's the point of having guards if they just stand there like robots?" Several tourists nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. A family from Japan quietly moved to a different guard, not wanting to be associated with Margaret's behavior. A teenage boy whispered to his father, asking if the lady was allowed to talk to the guard like that. His father shook his head and pulled out his own phone, sensing that something interesting might happen. James remained perfectly still. His training had prepared him for far worse than entitled tourists. He'd learned to ignore insects crawling on his face during summer posts, to stand through rain and snow, and to maintain composure when drunken visitors stumbled too close. This was just another Tuesday morning, but Margaret wasn't finished. She'd built a lifetime career of getting her way through persistence and escalating complaints. She'd perfected the art of demanding to speak to managers, threatening to leave bad reviews, and of making scenes until people gave in just to make her go away. In her mind, rules were suggestions that didn't apply to her. "Seriously, can you at least look at the camera?" Margaret said, her voice rising. "I paid good money to come here. The least you can do is cooperate for one photo." Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Mom, please. They're not supposed to move. It's their job." "What's a stupid job?" Margaret snapped back. "What kind of person just stands there like a statue? It's ridiculous." A British couple standing nearby bristled at the insult. The woman, wearing a Union Jack scarf, muttered something to her husband about typical American tourists, which wasn't entirely fair to the many respectful American visitors, but Margaret was certainly not helping her country's reputation. Margaret circled around to James's other side, trying different angles. When those photos also displeased her, she stepped over the rope barrier. It was a small movement, just 1 foot, but it crossed a clear boundary. Signs posted every few feet explained in multiple languages that visitors must stay behind the barriers. The rope wasn't there for decoration. "Ma'am, you need to step back behind the barrier," a nearby police officer called out. His name was Officer Davies, and he'd seen this scenario play out too many times. Some tourists genuinely didn't understand the rules, and a polite reminder usually sufficed. But something in Margaret's body language told him this wouldn't be one of those easy situations. Margaret waved him off dismissively. "I'm just taking a picture. Relax. The barrier is there for a reason, ma'am. Please step back." Instead of complying, Margaret moved fully past the rope, standing directly beside James now. She reached out and touched his uniform sleeve, brushing some invisible lint off the red fabric, as if she had any right to do so. That was when James finally moved. Not his whole body, but his eyes shifted down to look at the hand on his uniform. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of warning. His jaw tightened slightly. He'd remained motionless through children crying, through people making faces at him, through all manner of silliness. But physical contact crossed the line. Officer Davies moved quickly, walking briskly toward Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back immediately. You cannot touch the guards." Margaret's face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but with indignation. "I barely touched him. What's the big deal? He's standing in a public space. This is Crown property, and there are rules. Please step back behind the barrier now." The crowd had grown larger, phones now openly recording. This was the kind of content that went viral on social media. British tourists loved watching entitled visitors get put in their place. And international visitors found the whole scene fascinating. Someone started a live stream. Someone else texted their friends to come watch. Emma tugged at her mother's arm. "Mom, please, let's just go. We can take pictures somewhere else." But Margaret had dug in her heels, literally and figuratively. Years of getting her way through stubbornness had convinced her that if she just persisted long enough, people would give in. She didn't realize that British police officers, protecting the royal residence, operated under different rules than retail managers in suburban Connecticut. I want to speak to whoever's in charge," Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the plaza. "This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm a paying tourist, and I deserve better treatment than this." Officer Davies remained professional, but his patience was wearing thin. "I am in charge of this area, ma'am, and I'm instructing you to step behind the barrier. If you refuse, you'll be removed from the premises." "Removed? For what? For trying to take a picture?" Margaret's voice reached a pitch that made several people wince. "This is discrimination. I'm going to report all of you." James continued to stare straight ahead, though those who looked closely could see the slightest tension in his jaw. He'd been trained to remain composed, to be a symbol of British discipline and tradition. But even the most disciplined soldier has limits, and this woman was testing his. Margaret pulled out her phone and began recording Officer Davies. "I'm documenting this harassment. This is going straight to your superiors. You'll be sorry you ever messed with me." The officer's expression didn't change. He'd been recorded countless times before. "Ma'am, last warning. Step behind the barrier or you will be escorted off the property." That was when Margaret made her worst decision of the day. She reached into her oversized purse, her hand fumbling past the unnecessary keychains and decorative charms, past the hand sanitizer and spare sunglasses, and closed her fingers around a small canister of pepper spray. She'd bought it years ago after reading some online article about travel safety, though she'd never actually learned the proper laws about carrying such items internationally. Margaret's fingers closed around the pepper spray canister, and in her mind, she genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation. Years of always getting her way had created a distorted reality, where any resistance to her demands felt like a personal attack. She'd used the threat of complaints, lawsuits, and public scenes to bulldoze through life. It had always worked before. Emma's eyes widened in horror when she saw what her mother was reaching for. "Mom, no, don't you dare." But Margaret had already pulled the canister free from her purse. She held it up like a warning, her hands shaking slightly with adrenaline and righteous anger. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound that rippled through the plaza like a wave. Phones that had been casually recording suddenly focused sharply on the unfolding scene. This had gone from mildly entertaining tourist drama to something potentially dangerous. Officer Davies's entire demeanor changed instantly. His hand moved to his radio. Security alert at Post 3, female tourist with pepper spray, requesting immediate backup. Within seconds, the calm morning atmosphere transformed into organized chaos. 2 additional officers appeared from nearby positions, moving with practiced efficiency. The casual tourists who'd been giggling at Margaret's entitled behavior suddenly realized this was serious. Parents pulled their children back. A tour guide hustled her group away from the area, but many people stayed, phones still recording, unable to look away from the spectacle. "Everyone stay calm," Officer Davies said, his voice firm but controlled. He held up one hand toward Margaret while the other remained near his belt. "Ma'am, put down the pepper spray immediately. This is your final warning." Margaret's hand wavered. Some small part of her brain, the part not consumed by indignation, began to register that she'd miscalculated. The officers weren't backing down. The crowd wasn't sympathizing with her. Even Emma had stepped away, hands covering her mouth in disbelief. But Margaret's pride wouldn't let her simply comply. She'd gone too far to back down now. "I'll put it down when someone treats me with respect," Margaret said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "All I wanted was a simple photograph." James Thornberry remained at his post throughout this entire exchange, still holding his rifle at the present position, still staring straight ahead. But something had shifted in his bearing. Where before he'd been simply ignoring an annoying tourist, now his stillness carried a different quality. It was the stillness of a soldier assessing a potential threat, the calm before potential action. During his service in Afghanistan, James had faced situations far more dangerous than an upset middle-aged woman with pepper spray. He'd maintained composure under actual enemy fire. He'd stood guard in hostile territories where any moment could bring real danger. This training didn't disappear just because he was now wearing a ceremonial uniform in front of a tourist attraction. Underneath the red tunic and bearskin hat, he was still a soldier. One of the backup officers, a woman named Sergeant Mills, stepped forward with her hands visible and empty. She'd done crisis negotiation training and knew that de-escalation was always preferable to confrontation. "Ma'am, my name is Sergeant Mills. I can see you're upset, and I'd like to help resolve this situation peacefully. But I need you to put down the pepper spray first. Can you do that for me?" Margaret's eyes darted between the officers, finally beginning to realize she'd created a situation she couldn't control. Her hands were trembling now, whether from anger or fear even, she couldn't tell. "This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong. I understand you feel that way," Sergeant Mills continued, taking a small step closer. "But right now, you're holding a weapon in front of a military installation. That's a very serious matter. I need you to place the canister on the ground and step away from it." Emma found her voice again, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, please. Just do what they say, please." The third officer had quietly moved to flank Margaret from the other side, not threatening, but positioning himself strategically. Standard protocol for potential weapon situations. The crowd had grown larger, despite efforts to push people back. In the age of social media, dramatic confrontations drew audiences like moths to flame. Then Margaret made her second catastrophic decision of the morning. Perhaps it was panic. Perhaps it was one last desperate attempt to regain control. Or perhaps years of never facing real consequences had convinced her she was somehow invincible. Whatever the reason, she raised the pepper spray and pointed it directly at James. "I just wanted a picture," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Why couldn't you just cooperate?" The plaza went completely silent. Even the distant traffic noise seemed to fade. Every phone camera focused on Margaret and the guard. This was the moment that would be replayed thousands of times online, analyzed and discussed. Turned into memes and reaction videos, James Thornberry finally moved. Not frantically, not with panic, but with the controlled precision of someone who'd trained for thousands of hours. His eyes locked onto Margaret's face, where before he'd been looking through her as part of his ceremonial duty. He was looking at her with the full intensity of his focus. It wasn't anger or fear in his gaze. It was something far more unsettling, complete, absolute assessment. That stare carried the weight of his military experience. It was the look of someone who'd faced actual danger and survived. Someone who'd made split-second decisions in combat zones. Someone who understood real threats versus theatrical ones. Margaret, who'd spent her life intimidating retail workers and service staff with her demands, suddenly found herself on the receiving end of a stare that made her feel like she was being seen completely. Her bluff called, her bravado meaningless. Her hand, which had been so steady when she was confident in her righteousness, began to shake visibly. The pepper spray canister wavered in her grip. She'd expected fear or anger or some kind of reaction she could interpret as weakness. Instead, she got this steel-hard stare that seemed to look straight through her theatrics to the scared, foolish woman underneath. "Ma'am," Officer Davies said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Lower the weapon immediately, or we will take physical action to disarm you." Sergeant Mills had moved closer during the distraction, now positioned where she could quickly intervene if needed. The third officer spoke quietly into his radio, updating command about the situation. The entire response was professional, coordinated, exactly as they'd trained for. But it was James's stare that broke Margaret's resolve. She'd built a lifetime of getting her way by making others uncomfortable, by pushing until people gave in. Yet here was someone completely unmoved by her tactics, someone whose silence was more powerful than any words. The pepper spray suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hand. "I didn't mean ... Margaret started, her voice small now. All the earlier bluster drained away. "Place the canister on the ground," Officer Davies repeated. "Do it now." Margaret's arms slowly lowered. The fight had gone out of her completely. James's unwavering stare had done what all the verbal warnings couldn't. It had punctured the bubble of entitlement she'd lived in for so long. For perhaps the first time in decades, Margaret genuinely understood that she wasn't in control, that her usual tactics wouldn't work, that she'd made a terrible mistake. The pepper spray slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the cobblestones. The sound echoed across the now silent plaza. Margaret stood there, arms hanging limply at her sides, looking smaller somehow than she had minutes before. Sergeant Mills moved swiftly, kicking the canister away and securing it. Officer Davies stepped forward with handcuffs. "Margaret Whitmore, you're under arrest for threatening behavior and possession of an offensive weapon in a prohibited area." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Margaret seemed to deflate entirely. Emma sobbed openly now, mortified and frightened and angry all at once. The crowd maintained their distance, but their phones never stopped recording. This would be all over the internet within an hour. James Thornberry held Margaret's gaze for one more moment. Then his eyes shifted back to their 1,000-yard stare, focused once again on the middle distance. His expression returned to its ceremonial neutrality. He'd assessed the situation, determined it was being handled appropriately, and returned to his duty. The entire incident had barely interrupted his post. As officers led Margaret away, she looked back at James one final time. He stood there exactly as he had when she first arrived, as if nothing had happened at all. That perfect stillness, that unshakable composure, would haunt her far more than any words could have. The police station was nothing like the American precincts Margaret had seen on television. The building was older, more formal, with high ceilings and an atmosphere of institutional authority that made her feel even smaller than she already did. She sat in a holding area, on a hard plastic chair, still handcuffed. Watching officers move efficiently through their duties with the same professional detachment that James had displayed, Emma sat across from her mother in a separate area, no longer crying, but looking exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She'd called her father, Margaret's second ex-husband, who still maintained a cordial relationship with his daughter, even if he'd learned years ago that dealing with Margaret was impossible. He was arranging for a lawyer, though he'd made it clear this was for Emma's sake, not Margaret's. The initial processing had been humiliating in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Her purse had been searched thoroughly. revealing not just the pepper spray, but also a Swiss Army knife she'd forgotten about, and a small bottle of prescription pills that weren't in their original container. Each item was cataloged, photographed, and documented. Her phone was temporarily confiscated as potential evidence. Her designer sunglasses looked ridiculous sitting in a plastic evidence bag next to the pepper spray canister. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen conducted the formal interview. She was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a manner that was professional without being warm. She'd dealt with hundreds of tourist incidents over her career, from petty theft to international incidents, and she had little patience for entitled behavior that wasted police resources. Mrs. Whitmore, Detective Chen began, reviewing the incident report on her tablet. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you did today?" Margaret opened her mouth to launch into her usual defense. The speech about how she was the victim, how she'd been treated unfairly, how this was all blown out of proportion. But something stopped her. Maybe it was James's stare still echoing in her memory. Maybe it was the clinical environment of the police station. Maybe it was seeing Emma's disappointed face. Whatever the reason, the words died in her throat. "I wanted a picture," she said finally. Which wasn't an answer to the question at all. "You threatened a member of the household division with pepper spray," Detective Chen said flatly. "In front of Buckingham Palace, while being recorded by approximately 50 witnesses. The pepper spray you were carrying is classified as a prohibited weapon in the United Kingdom. Even possession alone could carry serious charges." "I didn't know it was illegal here," Margaret said weakly. "Ignorance of the law isn't a defense, Mrs. Whitmore. But more concerning is your behavior leading up to the incident. You ignored verbal warnings from multiple officers. You crossed security barriers. You made physical contact with a guard on duty. Then you produced a weapon and pointed it at him." Detective Chen leaned back in her chair. "Walk me through what you were thinking." Margaret struggled to articulate it. How could she explain a lifetime of learned behavior where persistence always paid off? How could she describe the bubble she'd lived in where her desires felt more important than rules or other people's boundaries? "I just got frustrated. He wouldn't acknowledge me. The officer was being difficult. I felt disrespected." "So you decided to threaten someone with pepper spray because you felt disrespected?" Detective Chen's tone carried no judgment, just clinical interest in understanding the thought process. "When you say it like that, it sounds terrible." "It was terrible, Mrs. Whitmore. Lance Corporal Thornberry is a decorated soldier who served in combat zones protecting his country. Today, while performing his ceremonial duty, a tourist threatened him with a weapon because he wouldn't pose for a photograph. Do you see how that might be problematic?" The name hit Margaret strangely. Lance Corporal Thornberry. Until that moment, James had been just the guard in her mind, more of an obstacle than a person. But hearing his name, his rank, being reminded that he was an actual human being with a career and a life, made something crack in the wall of Margaret's self-justification. Outside the interview room, the incident was already becoming international news. Video footage from multiple angles had been compiled into a viral video that major news outlets were sharing. Entitled "Tourist Threatens Royal Guard" was trending on social media. British tabloids were having a field day. American news stations were running segments about respecting cultural norms while traveling. The video of James's steel-hard stare had been captured in perfect high definition by at least a dozen phones. Online reactions ranged from amused to outraged. Many British commenters expressed pride in their guards' composure. Military communities shared the video with comments about the discipline required to maintain such control. Others criticized Margaret with varying degrees of harshness. A few, inevitably, defended her and claimed the whole situation was an overreaction. Emma's social media accounts were being flooded with messages, some supportive, many not. The video of James's stare was already being turned into memes. Screenshots showing his intense focus paired with various humorous captions. Compilations comparing his stillness to other famous moments of discipline. Deep dives into his military record by internet sleuths who discovered his commendations and service history. Overnight, Lance Corporal James Thornberry had become an unexpected internet celebrity for doing nothing more than his job, Back at Buckingham Palace, James had completed his guard shift without further incident. The relief guard had taken his position, and James had returned to the guard room for debriefing. His commanding officer, Major Harrison, wanted a full account of the incident. "Sergeant Mills says you handled it perfectly," Major Harrison said, reviewing the official report. "Maintained position, assessed the threat level appropriately, allowed the police to handle the situation." "Yes, sir." "Standard protocol for tourist incidents," James replied. He'd already filed his own brief report, documenting the events in precise military language that stripped away all drama and emotion. "Except this isn't quite standard, is it?" Major Harrison pulled up one of the viral videos on his computer. "You're rather famous at the moment. The press office has received dozens of interview requests." James grimaced slightly. He hadn't joined the military for fame or attention. He'd certainly never expected that simply doing his duty would result in becoming an internet sensation. "Permission to decline all media requests, sir." "Granted, though I doubt that will stop the attention. The point is, Thornberry, you represented the regiment well today. Some guards might have flinched when she raised that spray. You didn't." Major Harrison paused. "How did it feel, having a weapon pointed at you in front of the palace?" James considered the question carefully. In Afghanistan, he'd experienced the chaos and fear of actual combat, where threats were real and deadly. Today's incident, by comparison, had never felt genuinely dangerous, despite the presence of pepper spray. "Surreal, sir, but never threatening." She wasn't a hostile combatant. She was just a woman having a very bad day and making very poor choices. That perspective, that ability to assess situations clearly, without letting ego or fear dictate reactions, was exactly why James had been selected for the Household Division. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial decorations. They were active-duty soldiers chosen for their discipline, reliability, and judgment. Meanwhile, in the police station, Detective Chen was wrapping up the interview. Margaret had slowly, painfully, begun to understand the full scope of her actions. Not just the legal consequences, but the human impact. She'd disrupted dozens of people's days. She'd wasted police resources. She'd frightened her own daughter. She'd attempted to harm someone who'd done nothing wrong. "What happens now?" Margaret asked quietly. "You'll be formally charged," Detective Chen explained. "Given the evidence and number of witnesses, this will likely go to court. The charges could include threatening behavior, possession of a prohibited weapon, and potentially others, depending on the Crown Prosecution Service's assessment. You could face fines, possible jail time, and you'll almost certainly be banned from re-entering the UK for a period of years." Emma, who'd been allowed to sit in for the latter part of the interview, finally spoke. "I told you, Mom. I told you to just walk away. I've been telling you for years that you can't treat people like this, but you never listen." Those words hurt more than the detective's clinical recitation of charges. Margaret looked at her daughter and saw years of accumulated frustration and embarrassment. How many times had Emma apologized to service workers after Margaret's tirades? How many family gatherings had been ruined by Margaret's need to be right, to win, to dominate? "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and perhaps for the first time in years, she actually meant it. "You're not sorry yet," Emma replied tiredly. "You're just sorry you got caught. You're sorry there are finally consequences you can't argue your way out of." Detective Chen allowed the moment to sit, understanding that sometimes the most effective intervention came from family rather than authority figures. She'd seen this pattern before with entitled offenders. It usually took rock bottom before any real change occurred. Margaret was released on bail several hours later with strict conditions. She had to surrender her passport and couldn't leave London until her court date. She was banned from approaching any royal property or residences. She had to check in regularly with the police station. Emma arranged accommodations at a budget hotel since. Margaret's credit cards were frozen pending investigation into whether she could afford her bail conditions. That first night in the hotel room, Margaret lay awake replaying the day's events. But it wasn't the handcuffs or the police station that haunted her. It was James's stare. That moment when she'd looked into his eyes and seen absolutely no fear, no uncertainty, no weakness to exploit. Just calm, complete assessment. She'd spent her whole life believing that persistence and volume could overcome any obstacle. James had shattered that illusion without saying a single word. The weeks leading up to Margaret's court date felt like living in a nightmare. She couldn't wake from. The viral video had spread far beyond what anyone anticipated. News segments aired across 3 continents. Late-night talk shows made jokes about entitled tourists. Social media discussions debated everything from tourist behavior to military discipline to appropriate consequences. Margaret's lawyer, a stern woman named Patricia Thornfield, had been blunt from their first meeting. The prosecution has video evidence from multiple angles, dozens of eyewitness statements, and your own admission during police interview. We're not fighting guilt. We're negotiating sentencing. Emma had extended her stay in London, though she'd moved to a different hotel. She visited her mother daily, but the relationship had shifted fundamentally. Years of enabling behavior had given way to something harder, more honest. Emma was no longer willing to pretend her mother's actions were justified or that consequences were unfair. "I looked him up," Emma said one afternoon over tea, in a cafe far from Buckingham Palace. "Lance Corporal Thornberry. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He received a commendation for bravery. He's trained in counter-terrorism. And you pointed pepper spray at him because he wouldn't smile for your photo." Margaret stirred her tea without drinking it. "I know, do you? Do you really understand what you did?" Emma's voice wasn't angry anymore, just tired. "You could have been shot, Mom. If this had happened in some countries, armed guards would have responded with lethal force. But even knowing that isn't really the point, is it? The point is, you thought your want for a photograph was more important than his dignity, his duty, and everyone's safety." Margaret had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. Stuck in London with no one to complain to, no managers to demand, no familiar support system that enabled her behavior, she'd had time to think, really think, about patterns that stretched back decades, about relationships she'd damaged, about the person she'd become. Her ex-husbands had all cited similar reasons for divorce. Her adult children from her first marriage had minimal contact with her. Her friends, if she was honest with herself, were mostly other people who enjoyed complaining and finding fault rather than genuine companions. She'd built a life around getting her way. She'd never stopped to consider what she'd lost in the process. The court date arrived on a gray London morning. Westminster Magistrates' Court was imposing and formal, filled with the weight of British legal tradition. Margaret wore conservative clothing, no designer labels visible, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. The courtroom gallery was surprisingly full. Media representatives sat in designated areas, though cameras weren't allowed inside. Some members of the public had come specifically for this case, having followed the story online. Emma sat in the front row, her face neutral but present. What Margaret hadn't expected was James Thornberry's presence. He sat in the witness area wearing his dress uniform, looking as composed as he had during the incident. Their eyes met briefly when Margaret entered, and she immediately looked away, unable to hold that gaze again. The prosecution laid out their case efficiently. Video evidence was shown on screens. Witness statements were read. The pepper spray, still in its evidence bag, was presented. Officer Davies testified about the sequence of events and Margaret's repeated refusal to comply with instructions. Each piece of evidence built an overwhelming picture of guilt. Patricia Thornfield didn't contest the facts, but focused on mitigation. She presented character references from people back in Connecticut, though even those were lukewarm at best. She emphasized that Margaret had no prior criminal record, though several civil complaints had been filed against her over the years for various disputes. She argued that Margaret had shown genuine remorse and understanding of her actions. Then James was called to testify. He walked to the witness stand with military bearing, took the oath, and waited for questions. The prosecution asked him to confirm the events, which he did in clear, concise statements. No embellishment, no emotion, just facts. Then Patricia Thornfield had her opportunity to question him. "Lance Corporal Thornberry, did you feel your life was in danger during this incident?" James considered the question carefully. "No, ma'am. I assessed Mrs. Whitmore as distressed and making poor decisions rather than as a genuine security threat." "Were you frightened?" "No, ma'am." "Did her actions disrupt your ability to perform your duty?" "Briefly, yes." I had to assess whether she posed a real threat to myself, my fellow guards, or nearby civilians. Once I determined she did not, I was able to return my focus to my post. Patricia nodded. In your military experience, Lance Corporal, you faced actual combat situations. How would you compare this incident to those experiences? The prosecutor objected, arguing relevance, but the judge allowed the question. James took a moment before answering. In combat, threats are clear and responses are trained. Today's incident was unusual because Mrs. Whitmore wasn't an enemy combatant. She was a civilian in distress, making dangerous choices. My training allowed me to assess that distinction. Thank you, Lance Corporal. No further questions. The prosecutor had a redirect. Lance Corporal Thornberry, regardless of your personal assessment of danger, the defendant did point a weapon at you in front of a protected royal residence, correct? Yes, sir. And such behavior, if left unpunished, might encourage others to treat guards and security protocols with similar disrespect. I couldn't speculate on others' behavior, sir. But protecting the security protocols around royal residences is essential to their effectiveness. When it was time for sentencing remarks, the judge addressed Margaret directly. Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed all evidence and testimony in this case. What you did was extraordinarily foolish and potentially dangerous. You traveled to another country and expected their rules, or customs, and their security protocols to bend to your convenience. When they didn't, you escalated to threatening violence. Margaret stood, hands clasped in front of her, and for once in her life, she had no urge to interrupt or argue. The judge continued. Lance Corporal Thornberry displayed remarkable restraint and professionalism. His testimony today shows he harbors no personal animosity toward you. But this court must consider not just the impact on one individual, but the broader message sent by your actions and our response to them. The sentence came down. 6 months in prison. Suspended for 2 years, meaning Margaret wouldn't serve time if she avoided any further offenses. A substantial fine, mandatory anger management and cultural sensitivity training, and a 10-year ban from entering the United Kingdom. It was far lighter than it could have been. The judge noting Margaret's lack of criminal history and the testimony about her remorse, but it was still devastating in its finality. Margaret would carry this conviction for the rest of her life. After the sentencing, Emma waited outside the courtroom while Margaret handled final paperwork with her lawyer. James emerged from a side door, his duty to the court completed. Emma approached him hesitantly. Lance Corporal Thornberry. I'm Emma, Margaret's daughter. I just wanted to apologize for what she did to you. James regarded her kindly. You're not responsible for your mother's choices, miss. No, but I've spent years making excuses for her behavior, cleaning up her messes. I should have done more to stop her before it got this far. Emma's voice cracked slightly. She's never faced real consequences before. She's never had someone look at her the way you looked at her that day. I was just doing my job. No, it was more than that. You didn't yell or threaten or react with anger. You just stood there and let her see herself clearly, maybe for the first time. That stare of yours did more than any punishment could. James considered this. I've learned that the strongest response is often no response. Discipline isn't about suppressing emotions, but about choosing when and how to act. Your mother was looking for a reaction, any reaction. When I didn't give her one, she had nowhere to direct her energy except back at herself. Emma smiled sadly. I'm studying to be a therapist. What you just described is more insightful than some of my textbooks. They talked for a few more minutes before going their separate ways. James returned to his duties, the incident already fading into just another story from his years of service. For him, it was never about punishment or making Margaret feel small. It was simply about maintaining standards and discipline in a world that often felt like it had too little of both. Margaret and Emma flew back to Connecticut 3 days later. The flight was long and quiet. Margaret stared out the window for hours, watching clouds and ocean pass below. The viral video had mostly faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer scandals and stories. But its impact would last far longer than its moment of fame. Back home, Margaret's friends initially welcomed her with sympathy, eager to hear her version where she was the victim. But she found she couldn't tell that story anymore. When they asked what happened, She gave them a simple truth. I was incredibly rude and entitled, and I finally faced consequences for it. That honesty shocked people more than the incident itself. Margaret Whitmore admitting fault. Margaret Whitmore not demanding to speak to managers or threatening lawsuits. Her social circle didn't quite know what to make of this new version of her. The change wasn't instant or complete. Old habits died hard. Margaret still felt flashes of her former entitlement, still had to bite her tongue when service wasn't perfect, still struggled with accepting that rules applied to her. But now, when those feelings rose up, she remembered James's stare. That moment of being seen completely, of having all her bluster stripped away, of confronting who she really was. She started therapy, genuinely this time, rather than going through the motions to satisfy a court order. She reached out to her adult children with actual apologies rather than excuses. She took the anger management course seriously. Small changes, incremental progress, but movement in a direction she'd never traveled before. Emma visited regularly, and slowly, carefully, they began building a new relationship. One based on honesty rather than enabling, on boundaries rather than endless accommodation. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was real in a way their relationship had never been. Months later, Margaret came across a news article about James Thornberry. He'd been promoted to corporal and received another commendation. It's time for his handling of a security situation at a public event. The article mentioned the viral incident briefly, but focused more on his overall service record. There was a photo of him in uniform looking every bit the professional soldier. Margaret stared at that photo for a long time, not with resentment or anger, but with something approaching gratitude. James had given her something no one else had ever managed to, a mirror that showed her truth without distortion. His steel-hard stare hadn't been about dominating her or making her feel small. It had been about maintaining his own dignity and standards while allowing her to see herself clearly. She printed the article and put it in a folder with her therapy materials, court documents, and other reminders of that day in London. Not as a source of shame, though shame was certainly part of it, but as a reminder that some boundaries couldn't be crossed, some standards couldn't be lowered, and some people couldn't be bullied or manipulated no matter how hard you tried. The viral video occasionally resurfaced on social media, usually when discussions arose about tourist behavior or military discipline. Margaret had learned to live with it, understanding that her worst moment would likely remain accessible online forever. But she'd also learned something more important. That moment didn't have to define the rest of her life unless she let it. James Thornberry continued his service, the incident just one of many in a long career. He never gave interviews about it, never sought to capitalize on his moment of internet fame. For him, it remained what it had always been, simply doing his duty with discipline and professionalism. Two people whose paths crossed for less than an hour on a London morning, both fundamentally changed by the encounter. One learned that consistency, discipline, and unshakable standards could speak louder than words. The other learned that consequences couldn't be talked away, that entitled behavior eventually met immovable walls, and that real change required confronting uncomfortable truths. Years later, Margaret would sometimes find herself in situations where her old impulses rose up. Standing in a slow checkout line, dealing with a restaurant mistake, facing bureaucratic hassles, and in those moments, she would remember that stare. Not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of the person she didn't want to be anymore. That steel-hard gaze had become her conscience, her internal check against sliding back into entitled behavior. She never returned to London. The 10-year ban ensured that, but even after it expired, she had no desire to go back. That chapter of her life was closed, but in a strange way, she remained grateful for what happened that day. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most valuable. Sometimes it takes complete humiliation to create real change, and sometimes a silent stare from a disciplined soldier says more than 1,000 words ever could.